Welcome back to the Island of Lost Dads. I am your host. This is a very big day. It is a Friday. That's kind of not the big part of the day. If you're an American right now, then you already know why today's a big day. It's on the screen. Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, ending 50 years of federal abortion rights. This is big. Here on the Island of Lost Dads, what we talk about is how to be strategic in a complex world. So what I want to do today is, I'm not going to go into the details of the case. That is not my particular specialty. What I really want to talk about is what this case means for men. Obviously, we're going to talk about America. Sorry, folks, it's going to be a little less international today, but it's important. And it's important because this, regardless of where you live and regardless of how your particular state, province, or territory manages this particular issue, it's important to have some good thinking around why this matters, why we should care, why some of the takes, particularly coming from what they call the manosphere, God, I hate that name, but why the takes around this, particularly from people who get on YouTube and talk about men's rights and who talk about men's issues and talk about red pill. God, I hate that too. But the people who talk about this stuff, where I think they're totally missing the point. And ultimately what we want to do is we want to talk about how this affects men, our lives, our choices, how we can respond to it. We'll talk a little bit about how to think about it. We'll delve a little bit into politics. Enough preamble. Let's get into it. Here we go. Starting at the top, you already know this, but the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, ending 50 years of federal abortion rights. What does this have to do with the, for lack of a better term, manosphere, red pill community, men's rights, MGTOW, whatever you want to call it? Ultimately, what this channel is about is strategic positioning of information so that young people, primarily young men, can succeed in an ever increasingly complex world. And so that is the perspective that I take when I approach this story. I'm not going to get into the politics of it primarily. I'm not going to get into a lot of the ethics of it. We'll talk a little bit about that. Ultimately, I think it makes intuitive sense that I as a man should not be able to force a woman to have my child. I think that you can understand that. I think you can understand that a world where any man can force any woman by virtue of having the time and opportunity to do the crime should be able to force someone to produce an heir or offspring for them. That should be intuitive. If it's not, this is going to be a very tough conversation for you. If you're like, well, but it's going to be tough because you may not be able to handle this. But I assume that most people can understand why having the ability to force someone else to bear your children is a net negative for almost all parties except for the person committing the crime. Now, you may say, hey, well, what you're talking about, Carlton, would be a crime. Yes, it would be. But now what you've done is you've said, well, I have now created a scenario where, depending on how motivated this person is to see that progeny produced, they may be incentivized to say, hey, it is worth the time in prison to get the outcome that I want, to force this upon someone and ultimately to produce an heir I might not otherwise be able to produce. It becomes very obvious why this is a bad idea. And that is the most general case. Then we can talk about situations where incest is involved. Well, I think that we can understand why both ethically and genetically that would be a terrible idea. We absolutely do not want to remove those options. And this is how far we've come. There was a time when that was the red line, where it was like, look, we will not go past that, because even the most staunch conservative can understand that those two things, namely the R word as well as incest, that's a bridge too far. We recognize that to not have that in those instances would be a net negative for society. We're past that now. But it's fairly obvious that in cases where there is incest, number one, you're looking at very likely genetic issues for the child, as well as the trauma for the victim. There is no net win by forcing the children in these cases to bring these offspring to term. I would hope that would be relatively obvious, but as I look at this sort of pinned comment from Pink Book Lessons. Now, Pink Book Lessons, great channel. I'm not trying to send any hate her way. Great channel generally. A lot of really good information and a really good perspective. But this issue has been presented primarily to men as a win. And so everyone is telling you what we've won. Oh, look, the 304s. And if you don't know what that means, type it into a calculator, invert it, you'll get the idea. It refers to a garden tool. But the idea that men have somehow won, that the masculine world, the manosphere, men's rights, whatever you want to call it, we've won today. But no one is talking about what we've lost. Also, no one has been able to quantify what exactly we have won. And this is the primary reason for this video. To help look at this from the point of view, there are plenty of, and most people will take this position from the point of view of women. And that is the most relevant and that is the most central position. But that's already been quite covered. What I want to do is look at it from the point of view of men. So what is the value to a man relating to the women in your life as well as yourself in having a situation where some other man can force someone in your life to have their child? How is that a net benefit? See, fundamentally what they don't understand, what they deliberately obfuscate, is that this law does not apply. And by the way, this is a huge feature in a way a lot of sort of conservative leaning and ideological legislation is crafted. It is crafted assuming a very specific case. So what they're saying here is only promiscuous women have to care about this. But that's not true. Even if it was true, it would still be irrelevant. But even that isn't true. It's fundamentally untrue. This applies to everyone, both women and girls. And so you see that, like, well, why should I be able, or why should anyone be able to force a child to give birth to their child, to force that upon someone else? When you say that, for people who have normal amounts, not even extra normal amounts of empathy, but people with normal amounts of empathy, you're like, no, you shouldn't be able to do that. You shouldn't be able to force someone to work for you. You shouldn't be able to force someone to paint your fence or pick your cotton. Like, this is not terribly complex. But what the conservatives fear, and unfortunately this has to include a significant amount of content, particularly aimed at men, what is happening is rather than present you the whole case and say, look, this is the totality of what we're talking about. Do you support it or not? Instead, they say, well, this only promiscuous women have to care about this. But no, it's every woman. It is every girl. So you think to yourself, so now a young girl in high school assaulted by a teacher, groomed and assaulted. Again, everyone's concerned about grooming. Young girl groomed into a sexual relationship with an adult, and a child is produced. And now that girl will have to bear the child. How is that a net positive? So when we talk about it, we have to be really honest about what it is that we're saying. And so whether we're talking about the case of the R word or incest, where we're talking about cases where there's grooming involved, all of these should be obvious places where you're like, well, in those cases, there really should be an alternative. Well, now there isn't for some places. Now let's talk about other scenarios. Let's talk about, well, what if you need to get one in the case of the life of the mother? If you're familiar with what an ectopic pregnancy is, basically means it's a fertilized embryo that implants somewhere other than the correct place inside the woman's uterus, and obviously baby can't grow there. Which means what does that fundamentally mean? The baby is going to die. She is going to die. How does this help any of those scenarios? So your wife, your trad wife, has an ectopic pregnancy, but because you live in a place where you've decided to support legislation where you say, well, hey, I was so busy being mad at 304s, why I don't understand. We'll get back to that. But in that situation, you were so busy being mad. You were so fixated on being mad at this imaginary group of women that you think are getting away with something that you neglected to think, well, wait a minute. If my wife is ever in literally any of these very common scenarios where that a person can find themselves in, we actually don't have any options. We'll actually have to be fugitives. We'll actually have to try and get some other alternative, because where we live, we didn't think it could happen to us. This is going to become COVID 2.0, where once again it'll be, well, I didn't realize COVID was so bad. Maybe I should have reconsidered my health status and the vaccine. So what does this have to do with young men? When we think about what this means strategically for young men, you now are living in a world where you cannot take chances, where if something goes wrong, there's no other options. And so I pulled up a few things because I wanted to look at sort of, well, what are we talking about here? And this is from the Indiana University National Sex Study, which was the latest survey that refuted the idea that high HIV rates among African Americans results from riskier behaviors. Basically, long story short, African Americans are more likely than other groups to use condoms. Fantastic. So, after a promising start though, condom use sharply declines in all racial groups after age 18. What does that mean? It means, in contrary to what is commonly understood, black men are using condoms. Great. However, for everybody, sometime after 18, condom use begins to decline. So, generally kids starting to have sex use condoms. Then they don't use a condom one time, nothing happened, and they keep taking on more and more risk. After adolescence, a dramatic difference exists between what between black men and women report about their condom use. For example, black women aged 18 to 24, this is prime childbearing years, tell research that only 55.3% of their sexual encounters involve condoms. Black men, and this is it, black men in that same age range report that they use condoms in only 20.5% of their sexual encounters. By the time black women reach their 40s, less than 25% of their sexual encounters use condoms. Now, most women use more effective methods of contraception when they get into more consistent relationships. However, and this is it, black men report that their condom use rises until 50, with condoms involved in 41.3% of sexual encounters. Among black men, 40 to 49. The trend is opposite with white men, where it decreases. So what are we talking about here? Well, this is it. That we're only going from somewhere between 20.5% and about 41.3% over that same roughly 15-year period. So what does that mean? That means that significantly more than half of the sex that black men are having involve condoms. So let's go back to this again. Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, ending 50 years of federal abortion rights. Like, I feel like I'm insane. Like, the position from conservative leaning outlets is, hey, the 304s are big mad about this one. Guys, we're using condoms less than half of the time. So if we're using condoms less than half of the time, and we've just eliminated abortion as an option, what exactly do you think is going to happen if you do not have the resources to fly this woman to a state where she can get an abortion? What do you think is going to happen? And so when conservatives say, hey, this is what you've won, they're not telling you what you've lost. And so now for black men, I'm talking about black men because that is sort of the target audience here. But when we talk about what this means for black men, fundamentally, what this means is that your life has become more dangerous, not less dangerous. You now have to contend with situations where you now have a zero margin of error situation when you have sex. Now, do you think that this is going to result in a shocking uptick in condom use? I hope it does. But I don't think so. And the main reason I don't think so is that we are not thinking about this. The people who reportedly talk to men are positioning this as, hey, only promiscuous women have to care. Well, who do you think they're having sex with to produce these children? It's not other women, it's men. So when we talk about this, and the reason why I didn't want to delve too much into the ethics is because, frankly, I would hope that is relatively clear just from the scenarios that I've pointed out. But even if you don't care about any of that, and this is only about yourself, then what has happened if you live in one of these states, what this means is every sexual encounter you have has become more risky. Every time you may say to yourself, hey, maybe I won't use a condom. You live in a post-Roe world, which means if she gets pregnant and she can't, or you can't, or together your families can't get her to a place where she can have an abortion or get her what medical interventions are available to have an abortion, you're going to have a child. That's what this means. You are celebrating the fact that more men will have more children that they neither want nor can manage. And what happens when children are born into these situations where they were not planned, they were not provisioned for? What is the outcome? Well, taken from USA Today, a new report from the Institute for Family Studies, co-authored by USA Today, as well as sociologist Wendy Wang, finds large differences between black kids raised by their own two parents compared to their peers raised by single parents. Black children raised by single parents are 3 times more likely to be poor compared to black children raised by their own parents. Why do I bring this up? Because children with 2 parents who are married are more likely to have been planned. Children, as the result of hookups, are more likely to not be planned. Their parents are not together. That's sort of the nature of a hookup. Their parents may not even know each other. But again, since you remove the ability for women to terminate unwanted pregnancies, this is the outcome. But what does that mean? So again, this is what we're talking about. What does it mean to be in a post-Roe world? Let's continue. Black boys are almost half as likely to end up incarcerated. It's only 14% for intact families. That's two married parents. 23%. And once again, they are half as likely at only 12% to graduate from college. This is huge. This is huge. And so when we think about what this means, is that you will now have more young black children and black boys being raised in these types of circumstances, where now the children who would otherwise have been aborted will now get to live in these unstable situations where this is the realistic outcome for these kids. And again, the 304s are big mad. So you have kids being raised by women who were not planning these children, who are in fact single parents. You have fathers or the fathers of these children who they did not plan for or desire as a result of the low condom usage among black men. And ultimately, what does that mean? That means for every child that is produced, if this happened in America, and again, these numbers are gonna vary quite a bit, that what you're looking at for 1 to 2 children, anywhere between $500 and $1,000 a month. So you see here, a study looks at a hypothetical family with 2 kids, age 7 and 10. She makes about $45,000. He makes $55,000. Now, depending on what state you're in, you could be looking at, and again, this is for 2 kids, anywhere between $400 to $1,000. Nationally, it's about $700. So really, anywhere between these two values, and again, for a single kid, it could be, obviously, it would be less, but it also depends on where you live. So when you look at these things, and this is from Custody Exchange, just a tool on parental schedules. So when you look at these things, and we're going to talk a little bit about childhood outcomes as well. When you look at this, you have to consider that as a young man, or as a man in general, you have to contend with being insanely careful about not getting any of your partners pregnant. Now, I think that's a reasonable position to take. I think one should always take the case of extreme caution when having sexual encounters to avoid unwanted pregnancies. What this ruling does has made it so that risk is now through the roof. Because if something goes wrong, and things go wrong sometimes, if something goes wrong, what has happened today is your backup is out. And now consider this. No man is an island. You live with family. You live with friends. Your mom may be in a situation. Your friend may be in a situation. Your sister may be in a situation. And they come to you and say, hey, I need help. This has happened to me. Or, hey, I made a mistake and I need help. Well, guess what? That's on you as well. In as much as you're willing to help someone else. And so ultimately what I'm getting at with this video is, don't believe the hype. Do not believe that this is a win for men. This is categorically a loss. Whether you are a man who has basic human empathy, whether you are a man who frankly is mostly self-interested and is in relationships with women, this is a loss for you as well. There is no version of this story that benefits you, your children, the children produced by these arrangements. And so the notion that we should somehow today be celebrating this is absolutely insane. It is absolutely insane. And so ultimately, and I want to hear from you in the comments. Let me know what you think. This video is going to be long. It's already like 23 minutes long, but I wanted to cover this and I really wanted to get this out there. It's very, very important. Fundamentally, you have to understand that this has made being a man more difficult, not easier. This has made being a man more dangerous, more risky, more costly. All of those women are having sex with men to produce these children. Now, what the Supreme Court has done is they've taken away one way for you to say, hey, I don't want a child. She doesn't want to have a child. Now we're about to have a child. And if anyone has ever been in this situation where they've had a pregnancy scare, there's a reason why they call it a pregnancy scare and not a pregnancy party. It's a pregnancy scare because you're terrified that she's pregnant. She's terrified that she's pregnant because neither one of you want to be pregnant. And so when we begin to think about being a man, when we begin to think about these things, one of the things that I'm very anxious to talk about is how do we begin to show solidarity with women and not enmity. We are not at war with women. I always say this, feminism, not masochism. It is pretty obvious that when you consider yourself as part of an interconnected web of human beings, that someone's particular interest may not necessarily be my own. But because I understand human empathy and because I understand solidarity and the importance of solidarity, their issues are my issues. And conversely, they may not be me. They may not have my issues. They may not see, an issue with family court. But I'm looking for solidarity from them. So what I'm going to suggest is to resist the easy manipulation of conservatives online who will tell you you have won something today. And rather put forward the idea that the world has become more dangerous than ever to be a black man. And I'm going to leave off with that. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. If you have thoughts, and I hope that you do, please leave them in the comments. I will absolutely respond to every single comment that I get. I'm very anxious to hear your thoughts, and we'll see you next time. Peace.